Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Alyssa Watson.
And I'm Dr. Beth Molleson.
Thanks so much for joining us in the Veterinary Breakroom. In the break room, Dr. Beth and I have short conversations where we chat informally about relevant and sometimes hot topics in veterinary medicine. And this week, we are going to be talking about a bill that recently passed in Florida that it turns out accidentally exempted Florida veterinarians, some Florida veterinarians, not all of them, but some of them from CE requirements. And so obviously this was a bit of a surprise, especially to veterinarians in Florida when they suddenly received an email that they might not need to get CE. So we'll talk a little bit about how it happened, the fixes and remedies that are already in the pipeline for it, but also we wanted to kind of have a broader conversation about, regulation of CE and, what we think is important, for veterinarians. How much CE do we think is really necessary? So first off, I'll talk a little bit about this particular bill. It was a Senate bill in Florida, Senate Bill 382, sponsored by a senator. And it actually, it passed. I think it passed unanimously. And so then it was signed into law by the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, on May 17th of this year. So the bill's going to go into effect in July, and it will be in effect. They do have a remedy planned, but for right now, this is the law in Florida. And what this law basically stated was that there are certain professions that are regulated by by the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. And apparently that includes veterinarians in the state of Florida, even though other, traditional healthcare professions that you would think of, like doctors, nurses, and chiropractors and other people in that state are regulated by the Board of Health. But veterinarians are regulated in Florida by the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. And basically this law states that if you have been licensed for 10 years, for a decade, you haven't lapsed, your license hasn't lapsed, and you don't have any regulatory complaints against you, that you are no longer required to have continuing education to maintain your license. Interestingly, there are lots and lots of professions that are regulated by this board in Florida, and there were exceptions. They did list out several exceptions, people like engineers, certified public accountants, landscape architects, interior designers, contractors. So there was a list, and veterinarians somehow got just missed. It sounds like they just forgot us. There was even somebody had posted online a photo of a draft of the bill where somebody had even written in, "Oh, we should exempt veterinarians," but somehow that got missed and didn't happen. So I don't know. What did you think what was the first thing that went through your mind, Beth, when you saw this?
To be honest, the first thing that went through my mind is wanting to confirm that it was a mistake, because stranger things have happened than for someone somewhere in Florida to decide that pets don't need CE. You hear people complain about CE like, I attended my 30 hours on blah, 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 and it doesn't help me at all in day-to-day practice. So my first thought was like, maybe there are people out there that don't think you need CE. Personally, I was relieved to find out that it was a mistake. And that's, like you said, Alyssa, I think it's important that we emphasize it is going to be amended. The Florida veterinary licenses are renewed. I believe is it every other year on May 31st? I think it's every May 31st. So the goal is that this would be amended before it impacts renewal, but I don't know the timeline for sure. So the Florida board did release a statement saying, like, no one should lay off of their CE. We are planning to reverse this. You should still get your CE. So those were kind of my first thoughts. One of my other thoughts was like, why is anybody being relinquished of their CE obligations? I don't claim to know a lot about these other professions that are getting these exemptions. Some of the professions that require licenses that do now have the CE Exemptions are things like cosmetology. I think anyone that falls under the cosmetology, there's some sort of asbestos licensing. So there are certainly exceptions that were meant to be on there. That was my other question, was like, is this to support small businesses? Are these costs impactful enough to these professions that it has become a real issue? Is this a political move where, the politicians involved are trying to show that they care about these small businesses and they don't want to have them to have to incur these costs? There are like mold remediators were on there. It kind of raises the question of like, should my mold remediate? Like, is he going to be missing stuff if he doesn't get the CE? So that was kind of all running through my brain, is like, who's to say what professions really need this ongoing CE and who
Yeah.
doesn't? So it's a really interesting conversation. And Alyssa, I know we kind of talked about it in a broader scheme of things too, is like, what does this mean for us as vets with our CE requirements and the idea of everything being so state specific? And we've talked about the impacts of that before, but this is just another example of how vets in some states now temporarily have different requirements for CE and licensing than vets in other states. And it brings up, I think, again, the idea of the universal licensing
Mhm.
system and whether or not that's something that is on the radar for the veterinary industry. So those were kind of my initial reactions. But yeah, what else was going through your brain as you were thinking about this?
Yeah. When I looked at the list of people that were exempt, I had the same thoughts that you had, as to, you know, unfortunately, I didn't have time to really do a deep dive into why the senator felt it was important to bring this bill and bring this law. I will tell you, one of the professions that stuck out to me was harbor pilots, only because I like just learned what a harbor pilot was the other day.
Yeah,
So, do you
never
know what
heard
a
of it.
harbor pilot is?
No.
So I just learned what a harbor pilot was the other day because I'm actually adminning my cruise group on Facebook for my
Mhm.
cruise later this summer.
Oh, I love this.
And a harbor pilot, they're so cool. This is the coolest job. So, a harbor pilot is a person that captains a boat that knows like the ins and outs of their particular harbor. And
Mhm.
so anytime like a cruise ship or a big vessel comes into a port, into a harbor, they actually run out this little harbor pilot on a tiny little boat, and then he has to jump onto the cruise ship. There's like a ladder and a special door that he climbs up and like gets onto the ship, and then he takes over piloting the ship
Oh,
inside the harbor. I know, isn't that cool?
I get talk about professions I've never heard of.
Right?
Yeah. I
But I
mean,
thought I'm like, is this really somebody that I don't want to get any continuing education? Like this
that's the
person
next
has
question.
to
Right.
know all these different ships and all. I mean, all the different. You know, I mean, I don't know a lot about piloting ships, but I'm sure there's all different types of engines and things like that. And so, kind of yeah, just that little bit of like, well, who should be in charge of
Right.
telling professions what kind of CE, they need to have in order to continue to serve the public, and
Right.
who are they protecting, and are they protecting the public? And just like you said, there's a lot of economic factors that go into all of this, and I'm sure that those types of things come into the decisions about how often CE is needed, and what CE is acceptable. I know we've had conversations previously about should all CE be on, is it okay to get all your CE online, or are these in-person, CE conferences and things like that really critical? And there's so many things that come into play with that, and I think economics is a lot of it. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's my suspicion. Like you said, it's hard to, you know, do enough online research to figure out exactly why this senator supported this bill and introduced this and pushed it through. And it also really makes you wonder, of course, I didn't mention this, but one of my biggest reactions was like, how did this happen? If this was not intended, how did this happen? And so it clearly shows you that the boards were not heavily involved in this law. The Florida Veterinary Licensing Board, I believe, clearly was not very aware that this was going on. Yes, that exemption was supposed to be on there, but they were clearly hands off enough that this got passed. So it makes you wonder, like, is the decision making process for reducing the CE or eliminating the CE, is that decision being made by experts, or again, is it more driven by economics? And I'm sure some of these professions, you could make an economic argument that it is a hindrance to, maybe they're trying to promote growth and trying
Mhm.
to increase this number of these professionals in the state of Florida or whatnot. But yeah, it would be interesting to know more about it. But I think does raise again that bigger question of like, how did this, at least for vets, how did this mistake happen? And like you said, we've talked a lot about CE here, but it's so interesting how the CE requirements can be so different, and it brings up that interstate dynamic that I know we've talked about before, and I know AVMA talks about, and I know the human healthcare deals with,
Mhm.
but just that idea of, should there be some sort of what's the word for it? I keep wanting to say like buddy system, but where you've got that um
Almost like
what do you call,
reciprocity or yeah,
probably the fancier word, that
right.
reciprocity. And did they just, you think about things like national disasters or just
Mhm.
relief vets who can't practice 10 miles away because it's in a different state, and all the
Right.
scenarios where that specific licensing requirement is an issue, especially in the climate of needing more veterinary coverage in a lot of areas and things like that, and how these specific licensing and state by state requirements can kind of have a hindrance on the profession overall, at least in my opinion. I think there are other
Mhm.
people that feel like the states should have control, that they know what's best in their region. I know as I was looking into this, there were some vets that stated like, oh, I don't want, someone from Ohio coming to practice in Texas. They don't know about the X, Y, or Z local disease that we
Mhm.
have here. And, so this sort of goes back to the question of, should CE be more localized? If you want the Texas license, should you have to take certain set of CE modules on local disease states or things like that? But it does raise a lot of questions there.
Looking to protect your canine patients against parasites? Look no further than Simparica Trio, Serolaner Moxidectin and Pyrantel chewable tablets. The first chewable to offer triple protection from heartworm disease, ticks and fleas, and roundworms and hookworms. It's also FDA approved to block infections that may cause Lyme disease by killing deer ticks.
Use with caution in dogs with a history of seizures. Serolaner belongs to the isoxazoline class, which has been associated with neurologic adverse reactions. The most common side effects were vomiting and diarrhea.
Visit SimpericatRioDVM.com for full prescribing information.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, just kind of the varying. I know one of the repeated themes that I saw on some of the online forums was, the time frame. So apparently, Idaho requires 15 hours of continuing education every 2 years, which is vastly different from Nevada,
Mhm.
which requires 40 hours every 2 years. And so, but I mean, I don't necessarily think that requiring 2.5 times the amount or the hours of continuing education make Nevada veterinarians 2.5 times, more knowledgeable than Idaho veterinarians. I mean, I think we
Right.
can all say that's a ridiculous statement, right? So, but on the flip side, I do think that you need some requirement because it is very easy to just, to have things get pushed off like, oh, I'll read that, or I'll take that online course later or whatever. And so that's just human nature to kind of push things off. And so for me personally, if I didn't have my regulatory body being like, you need to do this CE, and we
Right.
need to, you need to show us that you did it. Which again goes back to though that in person versus online. I am a big supporter of, online um, webinars and things like that in order to fulfill these requirements for veterinarians, not only because of the cost, the cost that can be involved with travel and time away from work and everything to go attend a big conference, not to mention the registration, fees of the big conference. So cost as well as time, and I think that you can get, just as good of information from those types of online lectures and webinars that you can get, sitting in a classroom, especially at some of these conferences or things where it's a very similar program every year. I know that's another criticism that gets put out there. Like, this is the same lectures every year, the same kind of topics. And so what can we do and how can we leverage technology in order to make education more accessible, make these classes and things like that more accessible. I mean, I know all the stuff that we do here at Clinicians Brief is fantastic, continuing education. And if you added up all the hours that I spent, reading online forums and on Facebook and things like that, I think I probably get hundreds of hours of CE a year. I mean, I don't know how many times are you going through Facebook and you're like, oh, CE for the day, check.
Right. And I think with, like, you bring up this point of technology and how that does kind of change things from historically how we think about CE, where it really was that in the classroom learning. I mean, now compared to 30 years ago, but when I think a lot of us had that same gut reaction of like the internal gasp when we thought of the idea of eliminating CE requirements for vets. But I think on the flip side, you alluded to this with your comparison of Nevada versus Idaho. It's like how many of us could easily, I think you'd be challenged to prove that my 30 hours of CE every 2 years has changed a ton of patient outcomes or things like that. I think there are kind of arguments you can make on both sides. And I think what I would personally love to see, I would love to see like 10 of my 30 hours curated toward what like I need to know. Someone smarter than me, whether it's the state university, if there is one, kind of comes up with, hey, if you're a small animal veterinarian in Ohio, these are the 10 hours, like these are the changes that have happened. These are the local infectious diseases that we're seeing. Like, these are 10 hours you need, and then you can get the rest however you please. Because I think you could easily do those 30 hours every 2 years and not necessarily come out a better vet. So it would be not that I want to enforce the idea of more regulation and micromanaging of that CE, but it would be interesting to have a model like that.
Yeah, I agree with you too. That popped into my head as well. Like, if the big, con to a nationalized licensing and a universal CE requirements and universal licensing, if we're going to give up the pros of mobility, being able to change states easily, and everybody says those pros don't outweigh the cons, which is, each state being able to really, focus what these veterinarians are doing and what they need to know, then I don't see that really reflected in the CE offerings that they get, at least not here for me.
Right. Totally agree.
So anyway, it sparked a whole bunch of questions.
Yep. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out too. Neither Alyssa nor I are in Florida, but our Florida allies out there will have to keep tabs on what's going on and make sure you stay in the loop with what is going on with licensing in your own state. Always a good reminder.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So, well, that I think brings us probably to our win of the week. Beth, did you have a win for us this week?
My win is going to happen tomorrow. So this will day after recording, at least. So it'll have already happened, but I'm going to see, it's not vet related unless you count the fact that I'm going with one of my best friends from vet school. And that is that I'm going to see Lionel Richie tomorrow. And I'm very excited. So some of you may have heard me talk about all of my Elton John concerts in the past few years, who has now retired. So I'm looking to fill the void, apparently with other older singers. Tomorrow is going to be Lionel Richie. So I'm excited for that. That's going to be my win.
I have been really worried about, what would happen to your concert habits after Elton John retired. So I'm glad to hear that you're getting back out there.
I'm getting back out there. I will say, unfortunately, most of my favorite artists are over the age of 75, but my friend Adam and I were using that as an excuse to hit the concerts hard now. Cyndi Lauper, I know, is doing her final tour over the next year. So anyway, going hard now, and then I guess I'll go into concert retirement myself here soon. So what about you, Alyssa? Any wins this week?
Actually, you know what? I'm gonna keep my win themed from a little bit earlier. I told you I'm adminning my cruise group. And so one of the things that I did was we have 3 sea days at the end of the cruise to get back from Iceland to Southampton, United Kingdom, because that's where the cruise leaves in and out of. And so there's these 3 days to get back to Iceland. So on one of the sea days, I organized a 5K fun run walk.
What a go-getter.
It's so much fun. So, the ship that we're on, the Disney Dream, it has a track around deck 4 that goes all the way around the whole ship. So you don't on the outside, it's really beautiful. So I mapped it all out, and I'm like, okay, well, you have to do 7.75 laps to make a 5K. And then I did a sign-up sheet, and then I designed a medal. Yeah, I know. I got a little crazy about this, but I ended up, so then I just kind of got these DIY metal, kind of plastic bracket things so that you could make your own medal off of Amazon. And I just finished making 200 medals for all the people that signed up to do my 5K. So now I have to figure out how I'm going to get them to England.
This is fascinating, Alyssa. I know nothing about the cruise world. You were my only insight into the cruise world, and I just didn't even know this is a possibility. Do you have to consult the ship to organize this, or is this allowed?
Not consult the ship. We're just going to meet out there at runners at 8 a.m. and walkers at 9, and we're just going to go walk around the deck.
Oh, I love that. Well, please report back.
Well, thank you, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed the program today. And if we find out about any other states that suddenly drop their CE requirements, we'll be sure to let you know. Thanks for joining us in the Veterinary Breakroom. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, including a video version on YouTube. While you're there, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review us. You can also listen to or watch our podcast episodes on our website at cliniciansbrief.com/podcasts, or drop us a line at podcasts@vetmedics.com. Veterinary Breakroom is a Vetmedics production produced by Alexis Ussery and co-hosted by me, Dr. Alyssa Watson, and Dr. Beth Molleson.